Norse mythology is great, isn't it? It's one of the more commonly used mythologies in media, and that's probably for a good reason. It's a really cool mythology, but one that's still shrouded in a bit of mystery on account of the fact that there were many texts that are lost to history for one reason or another. I don't know when it started to take off as one of the primary mythologies to adapt in modern culture. It's always been popular, but not to the degree it has been in the past few years. Which is why it's surprising that a game that was inspired by Norse mythology was Max Payne, because coming out in 2001, it predates the current era we're in, where it has come up a lot. And the connection between Max Payne and Norse mythology isn't some subtextual thing or some accidental thing. This game was very deliberately inspired by Norse mythology. Before my most recent playthrough, I'd played Max Payne only twice, once in 2013 and once in 2020. During those times, I was not knowledgeable on Norse mythology, at least not enough to recognize this immediately. These days, however, thanks to the Nouveau God of War games and the Magnus Chase books, I am relatively knowledgeable on the topic. Not so much that I can recite it from memory, I still need to look certain things up, but I can hold my own. Incidentally, the Magnus Chase books, best thing that Rick Riordan ever wrote. Don't at me. And since the Norse connection within the first Max Payne game caught me completely off guard, I'd like to categorize it and discuss these very deliberate parallels as well as what they mean for the story. It's probably a topic that's already been covered before, but I don't care. When it comes to the connection to Norse mythology, the connections exist on two separate levels. You have the surface level, things that are named after well-known Norse mythological events or people, and then on the second layer you have the more subtle representations. Characters who are inspired or outright representative of certain Norse gods or monsters. It's the surface level that got me to notice the deeper level, and more or less shows you that everything here was deliberate. For a start, this game is based around a new designer drug called Valkyr. The Valkyr were winged maidens who carried noble warriors who died in battle holding their weapons to Valhalla, the warrior afterlife where they will live as immortal warriors until the end of the world, Ragnarok, where they will fight in the final battle. Valhalla also being the name of the secret government project that Valkyr comes from. The Valkyr drug is manufactured and distributed by a company called Aesir Corp. To be honest, the names of the drug and the company is so on the nose within universe that you think someone would draw the connection, but anyways, the Aesir are a group of gods residing in Asgard. The warrior gods, which represents roughly half the Norse pantheon. The other faction would be the Vanir, the fertility and magic gods who reside in Vanaheim. I'm assuming those were the categories that everything boiled down to in Norse culture. The other reference would be a club in the game that you have to go to called the Ragnarok, the place where you fight the first chapter boss. A club that has a quasi-satanic theme. Now, if you're like me, you'd have seen these surface-level references and thought to yourself, is that all there is? And then you would start putting certain things together, making certain connections in your head, and then you'd start to realize there's much more to this. This is where the second layer begins, beginning with the fact that the entire game is representative of Fimbulwinter. If you're not familiar, Fimbulwinter is the 3-year endless winter that transpires in Norse mythology, which is meant to lead into the final battle of worlds, where all the gods, all the monsters, and all the Einherjar, the God's chosen warriors, fight in the final conflict to birth a new world.
The blurb on the back mentioned Norse mythos and Ragnarok, the end of a Viking world with a terrible winter that covered the earth in ice, when vile crimes were rampant and all humanity lost.
They make it a point to mention how New York has been plunged into the worst blizzard in the past century. It's not a coincidence that this parallel exists, especially when you consider that this seemingly never-ending snowstorm that blocks out the sun lasts 3 days. The 3-year winter being represented by a 3-night snowstorm leading into the final battle. It's also worth noting that the events of the game take place 3 years after the death of Max's family, which could very well be considered a beginning of a sort of emotional winter, so to speak, where his own mindset is plunged into an eternal darkness that only ends when he finally avenges his family. But that might also be a bit of a stretch, because if that were the case, that would make either Max or a member of his family represent Baldur. Which doesn't really align with anything here because there's already a perfect option for who represents Baldur in the story. Baldur, of course, being the person whose death is the first sign of Fimbulwinter. The initiating incident of much of the game's events is your friend Alex being killed. He was the person who offered you a spot in the DEA, and once you went deep undercover, he was one of only 2 people who knew about you being an undercover cop in the middle of an underground world of gangs and drugs. So a character whose death then kicks off an adventure and a seemingly never-ending snowstorm, the length of which has a factor of 3. I'd say that checks out. Once you get into the weeds of the symbolism and representations, you start to realize that a lot of the parallels in Norse mythology are based on plot relevance and not usually the characterization or appearance. For example, Balder was the most beautiful and sought-after man in all of Norse mythology. Alex wasn't exactly that, he was more of an average Joe, but it's interesting because while we did see hints of a growing storm before the death of Alex, it's only once he's dead that they acknowledge how powerful and apocalyptic the snowstorm has gotten outside. I almost wish they would have acknowledged the city as being calm and still before the first level started, because that would have really hit this parallel home. But even still, Alex definitely represents Balder, especially given the fact that his last name is, well, Balder. Yes, his full name is Alex Balder, just spelt differently. And once you start looking into the names of each of these characters, you start to notice a pattern, that there are a number of characters who have a slightly on-the-nose name that tie them into their Norse counterparts, most notably Alfred Woden. He's the all-seeing, all-knowing figure within the game who helps you out on multiple occasions. He's always one step ahead of the cops and kind of exists above the standard societal structures we live in, plus he only has one eye. Something that's sort of hard to make out in these graphic novel cutscenes. It kinda just looks like he's wearing a pair of sunglasses, just with one eye poked out. But either way, he has one eye and his name is Woden. Just take away the W and he's exactly who he represents. And he also leads a secret society of rich people who pretty much control the entire world from the shadows. One could also make the argument that each of these unnamed members of the Inner Circle represents the rest of the Aesir. The irony is that this game's equivalent of Odin survives, whereas in actual Norse mythology, Odin doesn't survive Ragnarok. To be fair, Alfred doesn't survive the second game, but the Norse mythology symbolism and parallels don't actually carry over into the second game. But either way, there is every assurance that Alfred Woden is Odin, but if Nicole Horn, the main antagonist, is so powerful that even the most powerful person in the story is powerless to stop her, what does that make Nicole Horn in this scenario? Well, there's only one thing more powerful than Odin in Norse mythology. Only one thing so powerful that Odin can't control it or fight it, and that is fate itself. You see, the thing about Norse mythology is that fate is pretty much set in stone. Whatever fate decides for you, try as you might, you can never deviate. If you're destined to die at Ragnarok, nothing can stop that. And there are indeed creatures that control and weave the very essence of fate itself in Norse mythology. Creatures that weave the strands of destiny from the roots of Yggdrasil. And what are those creatures called? The Norns. And once again, this is an intentional parallel with Nicole, given her name, Nicole Horn. N. Horn. Norn. I wouldn't say it's genius, but it's definitely intentional. Though what is clever is that her last name Horn may also be a reference to the Galahorn, Heimdall's horn that signals Ragnarok, making her sort of the harbinger of the end of the world as well, which also fits given what she does to the Inner Circle. So personally, I choose to believe that her name has a very clever double meaning. Well played, Remedy. Well played. Of course, there are more than these 3 characters in the game, and so all these different characters, allies and villains, minor and major, they all have to represent something as well, right? I would say at this point things start to get a bit more interpretive. For example, BB, the corrupt cop who killed Alex Balder and blamed it on Max. Well, the obvious choice is that he's meant to be a parallel of Loki. Loki is the god of trickery and mischief. A couple of things that can describe his personality given what little we see of him. Trickery is a major aspect of his character given that he tricks the entire police force into believing Max Payne killed an innocent person, and he certainly has a mischievous edge to him given his obvious corruption to where he even flaunts his wealth from his corrupt dealings. But he could also be Hoder, the blind god who was tricked into killing Balder by Loki. It's certainly plausible, and he wears sunglasses that block his eyes, which could very well represent the parallel to Hoder's blindness, but Hoder did not intend to kill Balder. Loki was the one who wanted that to happen, hence it makes more sense for BB to be representative of Loki. I think it fits better given his more deliberate antagonism. Now, who exactly is Mona in this scenario? Well, much like BB, we're not looking for somebody who fits perfectly, just somebody who fits the same role in Norse mythology and the game. And to my surprise, there is somebody who fits the bill. See, what I was looking for was somebody in Norse mythology with part of Mona Sack's name in their name, since it was the primary indication when it came to 2 of the characters so far. It turns out there's a character who fits better than I could have hoped. It turns out Thor had a lover by the name of Jarnsaxa. There it is, right in the name. Jarnsaxa was a Jotun giantess and mother of Magni and Modi. You see, I always assumed that Sif was the mother of all of Thor's children, but it turns out the only child they had together was Thrud. It's possible he didn't even cheat on her, as Magni, at least, was born before Thor and Sif were married. And the idea that Thor only had a daughter with his wife also leaves space for Michelle and Rose in this story, Max's deceased wife and daughter. At least if you ignore the possibility of the timeline of the two relationships being reversed. I don't think their names have any relevance, but at least Sax does. And the funny thing is, that by association means that Max is the representation of Thor, god of thunder. I was gonna make a big deal out of going through all the gods to try and figure out who Max represents, but these bastards went and did it for me. Granted, that's not to say that Max and Mona are lovers in this game, that doesn't happen until the next game, but they were definitely hinting at something in this case. And the connection between the two names, it's too obvious to ignore. So that means Max is Thor, which to be honest, I was a little disappointed by. Thor is obviously the most well-known god in Norse mythology, partially due to his ubiquity with modern pop culture, especially in Marvel. But I was kind of hoping they would go for something a little bit less obvious for Max. I was hoping for something like Tyr or even Surtur. But even then, him being representative of Thor does make sense. Max is, after all, a man of pure power and determination whose hot-headed nature and impulsive mindset is both his greatest strength and greatest weakness. Plus, this sort of makes sense with BB's role in the story as a Loki, given that in Norse mythology, Thor and Loki were uneasy allies at best, enemies at worst. Their biggest conflict being over Loki's role in the death of Balder, which fits the story. It fits almost too well. This whole thing reminds me of a line from the game itself.
You piece together a jigsaw and the final picture is you finishing that same puzzle. A mad, green-eyed killer standing behind you.
Though minus the whole green-eyed killer thing on account of this whole thing not being that serious. The reason it feels like that is because this whole scenario feels like a rabbit hole you think is relatively shallow and surface level, only to go down and find yourself digging deeper and deeper and deeper as you realize that everything was deliberately thought out and put into specific places. Well, sort of. You see, I found myself confused because it's also generally agreed upon that Vladimir Lem represents Loki as well. This doesn't make sense, however, given the fact that we already have one of those, and he already makes sense. The thing is, though, I don't think Vladimir is necessarily subtle enough for him to be considered a Loki. I mean, the dude blows up a hotel at one point, so let's put our thinking caps on for a second. We would need somebody who's destructive on account of the fact that he keeps blowing stuff up. We would need somebody who's against the Aesir gods on account of the fact that he helps you find Angelo and therefore helps you in the conflict against Nicole Horn. Plus, while it's not apparent in this game, we know that he's attempting to usurp control of the Inner Circle, and if we're counting things that happen in the second game for Mona, then we can count them here. As a matter of fact, Vladimir's entire existence in both these games have sort of a destroy everything and build from the ashes theme running through it. He tries to destroy the Inner Circle and rebuild it in his own image. He also wants to destroy the entire foundation of the criminal underworld and rebuild it in his image. So it says to me that Vladimir has to represent an overall destructive image, and who better than the harbinger of Ragnarok himself, Surtur? That fits as far as I'm concerned. He sort of exists outside of the standard Aesir Vanir god structure, but also is an instigator of the destruction of all of it. There are other characters in the game that may have a specific association, such as Angelo Punchinello, but I don't think Angelo represents anyone particularly obvious. I tried comparing his name to a list of Norse deities and nothing came up, and when searching the etymology of the name Punchinello, a couple things came up. It's an archaic word for a short, stout, funny-looking person, and yeah, that checks out. There also seems to be a connection of some sort to old-school puppet shows, particularly something from England referred to as a Punch and Judy show. I don't know what that's supposed to be, but if Punchinello has some sort of connection to puppets, then that fits, given that Angelo Punchinello is a puppet for Nicole Horn. And given how deliberate the name choices were in this game, that was probably no coincidence. So if I had to guess, he's probably not representative of any specific character so much as he's an empty vessel to be controlled by Nicole. Meanwhile, there's Deputy Chief Jim Bravura. Characters alike Jim, as well as characters alike Vinnie Gognitti, prove that not every character was intended to represent a Norse figure, presumably because Sam Lake probably didn't want to hamstring the story by forcing every character into a particular archetype. Though I think there is a case to be made that Jim is representative of Freyr, sort of an uncorrupted force leading his own faction, the police, and is critically wounded, though not killed, by a character working for Vladimir, the aforementioned interpretation of Surtur. He could also be Heimdall, the gatekeeper of the Aesir, since the police basically work for the Circle since they control everything, and the police are kind of the lowest level of order keepers for the vision of the Circle. So this might be the stretch of all stretches, and is more than likely not intentional, but maybe there is a case to be made. Vinny though, I got nothing. So let's cut to the chase. Cut to the last example I can think of a definitive thing for this sort of topic. Jack Lupino. This is one I noticed straight away. Lupino is either an alternate spelling or a variation of lupus, a Latin word to mean wolf or wolf-like. You may ask how I immediately caught that. I could lie and tell you it's because of my magnificent brain, but in short, it's because of Harry Potter. No, seriously, if you've ever read Harry Potter and you don't understand the significance of Professor Lupin's name, now you know. Then again, it's not like you really need to look that far to find the parallels between Jack Lupino and wolves, given that he describes himself as one at one point.
I'm the wolf, yeah! I am the wolf!
Stop it. Get some help.
So this was something they were obviously trying to shove down your throat. As far as a connection to Norse mythology, there's a pretty obvious character in Norse mythology who happens to be a wolf. In fact, I'm not gonna lie, there's several. But what can I say, Norse mythology is very big on wolves. It's almost like wolves were very common in Scandinavia when these poems were written, or recited because a lot of them weren't written. Anyways. Skål, Hati, Gari, Freki, Garmir, and of course Fenrir. Also, I did not check to see if I was pronouncing any of those names except for Fenrir properly. I hope I got them right. It's generally agreed that Jack Lupino is representative of Fenrir. I had to look at what other people were saying about this, and I would say that the explanations that I've seen do make sense. Fenrir is a chained wolf driven insane by paranoia and isolation, which describes Jack Lupino himself, as he's a monster created by the very system he was part of, driven to insanity and isolation based on the chains that bind him. In this case, the hypothetical chains of the Valkyr drug. So while it's not a literal comparison on account of the fact that Fenrir is destined to kill Odin in the Battle of Ragnarok, and Jack Lupino definitely doesn't kill Alfred Woden, it does track from a metaphorical standpoint in many ways, certainly more than any other wolves in Norse mythology. Garmir is probably the closest outside of Fenrir, but Fenrir still has the more associated characteristics. But why is this all important in the grand scheme of the Max Payne story? Why does any of this matter? So what if there are parallels and symbolism that tie into Norse mythology? Well, because I feel like this is so much more significant than just some names and character roles. I believe that this aspect of the story creates at least parts of the foundational shape of the overall story. You see, there's this phrase that keeps coming up in the first Max Payne game, and in fact it's said most prominently by Jack himself.
I have tasted the flesh of fallen angels.
Calling the main drug, the very thing the plot bases itself around Valkyr, and associating it with the flesh of fallen angels, creates this scenario in my head that subverts a lot of mythology. What I mean is, the Valkyr aren't angels, but they are a similar idea. And of course, if you've heard of the term fallen angel before, you're probably familiar with what it means. It's an angel who's turned evil, an angel who's turned against their own divinity. And in this case, I'm stuck on the flesh of fallen angels thing because I'm struck by the idea that Valkyr are supposed to, for all intents and purposes, drag your soul to salvation if you're a worthy warrior. However, in this case, the Valkyr do not bring your soul to Valhalla, but rather it's a corrupting force that drives people insane. They're a corrupted salvation. And the only reason for an angel to claim that it's bringing you to salvation when it's actually bringing you suffering is for the angel itself to be evil, for it to be a fallen angel. And the whole tasting the flesh of fallen angels thing reads as though these metaphorical Valkyr are giving a piece of themselves to you, making you think it's a gift, but rather it's a divine punishment that drives you mad. To me, all of this speaks to the idea that Max Payne isn't an adaptation of the standard Norse myth, but rather it's sort of an inverse of the myth. where Valhalla is a corrupted utopia dedicated to destroying you and everything you hold dear. The Valkyr aren't taking you to a warrior's heaven, but rather an endless hellish suffering. Say that 5 times drunk. And fate itself, in this case represented by Nicole, is not set in stone, but rather something that tries to weave itself around your throat like a noose in an attempt to destroy you. Because the very forces that shape fate are attempting to use that against you and against everyone for its own benefit. Because despite Nicole only metaphorically being in control of fate, she's rich and powerful enough that she might as well control fate. And to me, that's one of the more interesting things about Max Payne, is that it's attempting to subvert the very tropes and very stories that it builds itself around, to the point where the very creatures that ostensibly reside in Valhalla actually operate in the fiery depths of Muspelheim. Think about it. The very place that the Valkyr drug is being researched and manufactured is under a steel mill, a foundry which is chock full of fire and death at every turn. In this scenario, that has to represent the fiery wasteland of Muspelheim, a place that may not be evil necessarily, but it's a place where resides the creatures destined to destroy Asgard, including Surtur, which works in a metaphorical sense of Nicole trying to destroy the circle here, and a literal sense of Vlad destroying the circle later, but circling around, Waka Waka, Muspelheim isn't hell, but it's also sort of a hellish domain. So in this subverted, corrupted version of the Norse myth, those who claim to be divine are seemingly in a civil war with the Aesir gods, with a Valhalla so corrupt that it now dwells beneath the fiery pits of the fieriest place in all the Norse world.
Valkyr had been meant to be a white-winged maiden that would lift you to a warrior's heaven, but it turned out to be a one-way demon ride to hell. The devil was in the drug. I knew. I had met him.
And all of this is being done under the guise of divinity. The name of the company being Aesir Corp is possibly an intentional bit of irony, because Nicole is fighting the forces that consider themselves the Aesir, while Nicole herself uses and bastardizes that label. In fact, she's responsible for most of the metaphorical Aesir being killed while pretending to be what they are, possibly to further Nicole's delusion that she's the one in the right here. She sees herself as the Aesir. And yet the irony is, Nicole has gone to hell in the hopes of getting a little bit closer to heaven.
And now I was going to kill her, the queen of the underworld who had tried to lift herself a bit closer to heaven with her drug money.
This is a phrase that comes up in the story, and one of the acts is even named A Bit Closer to Heaven, because Nicole is attempting to gain all this power and influence to be able to find herself beyond consequences, beyond the things that hold down the average person. She wants to believe that she is so much more powerful than anybody she encounters, as if she wants to believe she is above the gods on the totem pole, divine beyond all divinity. And her attempts to live among the angels is ironically what causes her to fall to earth, as in the end, she plunges from her skyscraper, which is literally a little closer to heaven. To paraphrase a particular song, proving herself to be nothing more than a devil with a god complex. And this is all perhaps only scraping the surface. I'm familiar with the characters, specific personalities, and various tropes associated with Norse mythology, but I'm not actually deeply familiar with how the Norse myth plays out as a story. So perhaps if I were to dig deeper into this, I would find that the very structure of the game is deliberately modeled after the structure of the Norse myth. Then again, this could very well be as deep as it goes, but still, it's such a layered and deliberate story with so much room for interpretation about what it all means. Of course, a lot of this is symbolic. Symbolism and parallelism doesn't itself make a good story, but I find myself drawn to this in the way the story is able to invoke all these different themes and all these different stories while still having a quality story in its own right. It takes a lot of skill to write a good story by itself, let alone create one with multiple levels, where you can see a deliberately written deeper meaning. I love it. I think discovering this and really digging into it has given me a deeper appreciation for how well thought out the story was. It's something that's good in its own right, but has so much more deliberate thought put into it than I could have imagined. And also more depth than I could have imagined. Possibly more than I'm even able to think up right now. I've got to give it to Sam Lake. I think he's earned his flowers. He's a quality writer who made an excellent story. And that's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Also, if you're on mobile, hit the hype button for whatever that does, I'm still not sure. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.